Hello, and welcome to the Hans Brinker Leadership Series, Extraordinary Leaders in Extraordinary Times by Adi Partners. I'm Sanjay Vishwanathan.
COVID-19, the pandemic of this millennium, has changed our daily lives irrevocably. People fighting this pandemic at the coalface, say in healthcare, travel, supply chain, government, non-profit, and media, deserve recognition. I am Hiral Desai. Sanjay, we've had some amazingly insightful discussions in the Hans Brinker Leadership Series so far, isn't it? And the response that we've got from our viewers across social media platforms has been overwhelming. Firstly, I would actually want to thank all the viewers for tuning in every couple of days.
Indeed, Hiral. It's been a fascinating journey already, and I can only imagine what the next 160 odd weeks is going to be as we try and take this program forward. So I'm really looking forward to identifying some extraordinary leaders in these extraordinary times with you and sharing world-class practices with all our viewers in combating the coronavirus. And ultimately, to create this remarkable cohort of champions who can influence and energize this war against COVID. This series is, as you and I have been talking about here, it really provides everyday leaders a platform to share their best practices and for us and our viewers to appreciate the tremendous efforts they're putting in this fight. So our journey, I'm delighted to say, will take us across the globe, from India to the Middle East, to the United Kingdom, to Europe, to America, and then over the Pacific back to Far East and into China.
Right, absolutely. I think all of us are looking forward to this journey. In fact, today we have a serendipitous guest, a doctor who's also associated with NGOs in providing relief. Please welcome Dr. Pavitra Mohan, a pediatrician, a noted public health expert, and co-founder of Basic Healthcare Services. Welcome to the Hans Brinker program, Pavitra. My first question is, the fight against COVID-19 has actually been like fighting a war with an invisible enemy. You have been writing extensively as well on issues of health systems and health policy. What is your take on this pandemic, and how are different nations supporting the relief measures according to you?
I think there is so much said and talked and written about it that it's difficult to say what's the new perspective here. We've probably been, this is the first time ever that there has been such an overload of information from every quarters and for everyone that it's really crazy that where do you start talking about it in a broad sense. A few things I would like to start with. One is that it's not the most infectious virus ever. Right? There have been viruses which have been much more infectious, which are still prevalent. Measles, for example, polio has been eliminated in most countries, but both of these viruses, for example, have been much more infectious than the COVID virus. The other is, it is also not the most fatal virus ever. Right? It's not the most lethal virus ever. There are viruses which are so much more lethal. Ebola virus, for example, it has still not been eliminated from Africa, even now as we speak, raging for almost 8-10 years. It is some 20 times, 30 times more lethal than coronavirus. The other thing I would like to speak at this point of time is that the measles, for example, right? We say that, okay, but we don't have a vaccine for this virus and therefore it is, right? But even when we have vaccine, for example, for measles virus, the vaccine is probably 40, 50 year old. Even now, it doesn't reach all the children of the globe, and many children continue to die because of measles, despite having a very potent vaccine for many years. And therefore, I think what makes it unique is a combination of both infectiousness and the lethality. But more importantly, I think it is because it doesn't spare anyone. It has spread rapidly. That is what is causing a fear, which is not necessarily because of its potential to kill alone. There is also, I think, in this age of information, there is so much of information around it that also raises the fear factor as well as the huge concern that it is causing across the globe. I have a bias because we come and work in areas which are remote, which are rural, where there is so much of morbidity itself. And for us, when we see a lot of people who contract and die of tuberculosis, of diarrhea, of pneumonias, on top of that, a virus, which is, of course, it does cause. So there is no one death cannot be compared to others. But at the same time, when we see that there is so much of morbidity elsewhere as well, we take this as another virus that needs to be dealt with the best possible understanding of the disease, and not only of the biomedical part of the disease, that where is the vaccine, where is the treatment. But the question is, how do you make lives better for people despite managing the epidemic, managing the virus, finding out the vaccine, but at the same time ensuring that people's lives become better. At the bottom line is a human life. It's not a virus or a cure of it. It is how do individuals, people continue to live a life that is decent, where they have access to healthcare, they have access to food, etc. So how do you manage it in a manner that the virus it's not going to go away anytime soon? That's the best possible, whatever we best know about it right now, and of epidemics in the past, that no virus comes and goes suddenly. It may, but then it can also reappear, or another viruses may come. It is definitely not the last epidemic or pandemic of the millennium, and it may not be the most difficult one to handle, because we have many years to go, decades to go in the millennium, and there may be more. The question is that how do we ensure that we manage it in a manner that is people-centered, that improves, that does not disrupt the lives of millions of people across the globe, and we do not lose sight of that human life at the center, and of other maladies that affect human beings across the globe.
Right. Pavitra, an interesting point that you made is with regards to tuberculosis, diarrhea, the kind of, the quantum of morbidity, the level of morbidity that you're seeing. Now, do you think that's something which is causing less fear amongst the rural population right now? Because the biggest positive for India right now is that the pandemic has actually not really damaged rural areas that badly, and which is the backbone of our economy. What is your view on it?
I think, look, the disease, we know that how it started was from China, from people who traveled overseas and came to India since late December, early January. And in the beginning was restricted to that population who had come, or their immediate contacts. Right? Because people in rural areas in general, in most places, are not traveling overseas and coming back, and therefore the risk of infection was low to begin with. The other issue is that but at the same time, there are a large number of people, the migrant population, that for the first time after decades, that we became aware of their existence in cities, right?
Correct.
Who build our houses, who provide the services that we require to stay afloat. Millions of them who come from villages to cities to work, right? Interestingly, when there is a different question about the lockdown and its impact, but I think the way the epidemic spread, it continues to be largely located within those who are urban and who have been traveling and their contacts, right?
Correct.
A lot of these migrant people who came from rural areas do not have any physical contact with the people who are their employers, or they're far removed. We've seen that in for example, in places of construction or in factories, there is very little interaction between the boss and the mazdoor on the ground, right? And that has, in many ways, has probably had, at least initially, led to a limited spread among the people who had migrated from the villages to the cities and then came back. We've just recently concluded a city which we right now have just shared it with the press and came yesterday. Is that we tracked almost 1,200 migrants who came from the hotspots of Ahmedabad, Mumbai, and Indore to Rajasthan, to the areas that we work in a primary health sector area, from in the last month, in the month of March, right after the lockdown was announced, and many people suddenly came back. And we found not a single case of COVID over next 2 weeks. We followed them over next 2 weeks. A few people developed symptoms which could have been COVID. We got them tested and nobody was tested positive. So what I'm saying is that these are people who had been living in cities, in hotspots, but their interaction with so there is a kind of social distancing that exists, right? You don't interact with people who are richer, who are more affluent. You're not, so that's why these people are so invisible till now. Having said that, there are some of them and certain trades. For example, if you're working in a kitchen or working in a restaurant, or you're working as a shop boy, then you're likely to come in contact with, and therefore we need to be careful, and there is likelihood that it might spread. The other issue is of the comparison of as the question that you started with, that there is so much of morbidity around there, right? One common figure that I keep talking of is that 1,200 people who die of tuberculosis every day in India, right? So much of
200
that is 1,200 people who die of tuberculosis every day.
Wow.
And so far, the number of COVID cases that we have is 1,200 in India over the last 3 months. We recently did some estimates and found out that 20 lakh people in almost 2 million people in India had died from the time that first case was detected till 14th January, for which the lockdown was announced. 2 million people had died in India based on the best estimates of the previous years, because we don't count them daily. We release the reports after several lakh period, but based on the trends, 2 million people would have died, and about 500,000 of them could have been prevented if they had access to good quality care. So we are talking of magnitude of 500,000 people dying in 3 months because of preventable causes. And therefore, in a lived-in experience of a villager, death is not something that they are not used to, right? I mean, they have, and therefore their perceptions are based on that.
Right. That's an interesting perspective and interesting statistics as well that we are getting, Pavitra, because the scare over here was that once the migrant community starts moving back to their villages, probably the spread would increase. And the numbers that you're showing us are very interesting on this front, that the rate in terms of infections have not really increased. And that is going to be one of the major positives. In fact, then taking, experience out of this, what according to you would be the best strategy to fight the virus if you have to look at the urban side of it?
I mean, I think, again, as I said, that I think one first thing we need to understand is that there is not going to be a silver bullet or a magic bullet that will end the epidemic abruptly. Whether it's a vaccine or is it a treatment, nothing is going to kind of end the epidemic abruptly. It is not unlikely. There may be, some kind of a weather changes or the mutation in the virus itself, which might make it dormant or make it, disappear for a while, etc. And as I said, that there are lakhs of such viruses floating around in the world, and some of it again can then trip over to human beings and can again infect. So I think first thing is to have that understanding that it is not we are not fighting a disease against a virus. We are kind of looking at a situation where it has been created by a lot has been written and talked about it. That how do you interact and with the wildlife and the globalization, etc., which have potential to cause many more epidemics in times to come. Having said that, the strategies are well known, right? I mean, there are lockdown is a part of it. That reducing interaction, improving distancing, hand washing, etc., are the known kind of intervention. But I think the more importantly is that how do you make it? One is that don't think of a quick gains. Second is, we can't build our response based on fear. It has to be based on a solid understanding of what the incidence is, what the mortality rates are. Two things which are even after 3 months and so much of media attention and technology and all, we don't know. We really don't know, because we still haven't done large enough studies to understand its incidence or its death rates. What we are seeing in the media every day and by the government and other agencies are the number of cases amongst those tested, right? And I think having background, anybody who has any quantitative background will know that it's a highly skewed sample that we are talking of. So we really do not know. If you test 1,000 people, and we know that a lot of people are asymptomatic, right? So if you test everybody in a community and then you find out that how many contracted and how many died, that will give a good beginning point to start responding. We don't know the magnitude of the enemy. We don't know how many people are infected, what is its death rates. And we are fighting a whole battle. We have opened multiple channels without knowing that. So I'm not saying that all of it is not required, because sometimes you have to start somewhere before you build an understanding. But I think after 3 months or 4 months, we have to be in a better space. We have to understand it better, and therefore do carefully designed studies to understand the magnitude of the problem and what is it going to mean in the best possible situation. It cannot be based on the reported numbers, for example.
So how are the communities in rural India? How are they dealing with COVID? Given the fact that they already have a disproportionate share of ill health, and then you've got this asymptomatic aspect of the the episodes. So you really can, it's not something that one can very easily diagnose. So we'd love to know, how is rural India dealing with it?
So, as of now, the way rural India, so there are two aspects to it. One is how communities are dealing with it, and the second is how rural health systems are dealing with it, right? So, as I said, that how communities are dealing with it, they are right now much more troubled by the fact that they don't have jobs, they don't have money, they don't have food, and they have very, very limited mobility around that. And there is a fear and stigmatization, right? So that is how they are right now looking at it, as something that has disrupted their lives and livelihood. Even earlier, they were living very, very precariously. So, for example, many kids who have come back from Ahmedabad are just, with blank looks on their faces, are asking us that, when will it open up? When can we go back and start working? Those who have no skills and had very little education. There are others who are slightly more educated, slightly more skilled, but still had to migrate because there were no options for jobs in rural areas, have started thinking of an alternatives, that they said that this is too bad. I mean, you can't be, this is robbing them of their dignity, of their very, very precarious kind of situation. Anytime this happens, and then you're again thrown out or are treated as somebody who's carrier of a disease, etc., with no problem of theirs, have started thinking of an alternative, right? So in some ways, it might be a watershed for those who are slightly more educated, slightly more skilled, and if they are supported well, might look for options which are more rural based or a closer home, rather than being in a city where there's nobody and they're in a situation where they have no family around. And in any case, even before, so what I'm saying is that even before the COVID and the lockdown, their lives were difficult and precarious, but this has got them thinking and has also brought new kind of dimensions.
How is BHS helping them, especially the rural communities? Right. In this war?
So there are several things, Sanjay, that I think that when it started, when the situation had just started and the lockdown and the more strict measures were being announced, we immediately convened ourselves and said that what are our objectives to deal with the situation. First objective was, of course, to stay safe, our own staff and everybody. And we immediately, therefore, looked at the best practices world over, what can be implemented at the primary care level in a reasonable manner, without getting fearful. But what is it that's required to restructure ourselves? And therefore, we redesigned our clinics, we introduced new protocols, etc. And another important thing was that how do you keep your staff motivated? Because they are also being subjected to a lot of information fear. Their families are fearful that why are you working in while others have stopped working, or they are not. You are in a high risk job, etc. So we continued in a transparent manner communicating with them about the disease, about its lethality, about its infectiousness, and about the preventive measures, etc. As well as staying much more connected with them to deal with their any issues or apprehensions. And just to kind of make them feel that they're not alone, we are all in it together. So that helped in ensuring that our clinics are staffed and they are in a good state of mind and they're able to continue to provide care. For us, continuity of care was extremely important for the same reason that I said earlier, that there is so much of morbidity which is non-COVID in nature, that if we reduce our scale of operation, then people will die of many other things. Despite that, of course, we are seeing patients who came and died of tuberculosis because for last 2 months they were taking drugs from a government store somewhere, and they were not from a government functionary earlier, and they did not receive the drug for last 2 months. We helped. So what we started immediately was to go out and we identified from our EMRs and from our records that people who are on chronic treatment of tuberculosis, of HIV, or diabetes, hypertension, if a person with diabetes does not receive treatment for a week, if the insulin is finished, the person can just die. Right? So we identified those from within our EMRs and records and went out. So we had our outreach team that started delivering drugs at the household level, because they could not come. They could not come because the police would not let them come. The roads are not there. The public transport is not functioning. So we started traveling 40 kilometers, 50 kilometers, 60 kilometers to our outreach staff to deliver drugs at the households. We also offered services for making drugs even more available, even those who are not registered with us, but because they were not able to enhance our level of services to manage things which would otherwise we would not have managed. But then because they had nowhere else to go, we introduced those protocols and started working there. We also started a telecounseling because of the myths and misinformation and fear that was there in the communities that everybody will die if this happens, and that women should start fasting because to ward off the AIS causing the epidemic. All those myths had started creeping in, and we therefore started a telecounseling helpline, which is more. It is not passive because unlike in cities, they're not likely to make a call and ask for it. So we started reaching out to the volunteers that we knew, women and men in our advisory groups, the community groups, and made thousands of calls to them to discuss the issue and explain. A call typically lasted about 20 to 30 minutes of conversation. What are you thinking? And then slowly dispelling some of those myths, which is continuing, which we had kind of decreased in between, but suddenly now with the lockdown being opened up and more migrants coming in, there's another second level of fear that started generating. So we again started reaching out to more and more people to dispel some of these myths and counsel them on. We also run sort of daycare centers in the communities that we work in. Unfortunately, Anganwadis, which are supposed to provide meals to young children under 5 years of age, have also more or less closed down during this period. We run a daycare center for children under 3 in our areas, and we had to stop because the direction from the government was that you don't want children to come together and they can't be in one place. So we again ensured that we started a model where we would reach out to the household. So the Fulwari Fulwaris as we call them. So they cook food and then they go out and deliver food at the household because children could not come and be at one.
Correct. These are great initiatives, and people like you are looking to improvise on a daily basis also is really good. Tell me one thing, Pavitra. The government is already providing some bit of relief right now to this migrant community, to people in the villages, people in the scheduled caste. Now, do you think that's actually reaching them, or do you think there are gaps that still have to be filled up?
So, I've, in these communities, I think there is always a need for a community partnership, right? So reaching the last mile is never easy. No government can ever reach out to the last mile, and therefore there has to be much more openness for. In many of the disasters that I've seen earlier, it's ultimately the immediate response is often by the community because nobody is able to reach, not even NGOs. So the immediate response is communities, then community-based organizations and not-for-profit. The government reaches, but every time there is it is likely to be inadequate. And it may not reach the last mile often, right? For example, in this case, as I said, that I was really impressed that within a couple of days, the wheat had reached most of the households, right? But there were still about 5 to 10% households where even the wheat has not reached and they had nothing to eat. Similarly, wheat is not sufficient. You need, how do you cook? Where is the oil? Where is the pulses? So nothing else. So in terms of relief, what I would say is that the best efforts of the governments anywhere in the world, and especially in India where there is so much levels of bureaucracy and the decision making is often delayed, there is always a scope for doing so much more. And therefore, I think partnering and looking at people-centered ways to reach is extremely important. Both for the governments need to do it more, but they also need to, I think, partner more and more to be able to reach. In many places, that was not the case. We were fortunate to be able to still respond to the situation, and therefore that helped. But of course, but at the same time, no NGO or any other organization can also replace the reach that government has and the resources that government has.
So if we were to switch tracks a bit here, Pavitra, and talk about the role of technology, and if I want us to look at this in a couple of dimensions. So one dimension is, how do nonprofits like you leverage technology, especially in scenarios of pandemics like this, number one. And number two, we are seeing the trend of telemedicine now pick up. I think we've truly seen the dawn of the era of telemedicine. So now if you wear the clinician's hat, from your perspective, how do you see the role of telemedicine in pushing back the pandemic?
So, I think whether it is times before the pandemic or during the pandemic or post-pandemic, there is a huge role that technology has in delivering good quality healthcare to populations, including the most underserved in the last mile. It's actually even more important. Telemedicine is one of them, which is important for being able to access specialized consultation and specialized care. Diagnostics is another huge area. To be able to use diagnostics point of care at the time when people need it is another huge area. The third area is communication and using more technology enabled ways to communicate with families and individuals to change their behaviors, dispel myths, etc. The fourth is energy. I think the solar energy, etc., to keep the peripheral health services functioning and not dependent on. Within that, I think so. Each one of them has a role. The problem is that there are two problems. One is that if we see technology as substituting and not enabling, I think substitution is not possible. Human beings are required to deliver healthcare. You need empathy, you need understanding, you need somebody to comfort and to touch and feel, and also to understand the problem. It cannot be substituted, and that's where the problem lies often. That when you want to see, when you see it as an enabling, then it's really extremely helpful. It can significantly improve the quality of care. It can improve access, etc. The other issue that we have been facing for the last several years, and also during the pandemic, that there are a lot of solutions out there, right? But often the solutions are prepared in isolation with the needs that emerge. Because I think especially in rural and remote areas, for example, one simple example I'll give of connectivity, right? The areas that we work in fact, in one of the clinics, there is no connectivity. The telephone is also barely reached. When we started, there was no telephone at all. So we took a BSNL phone, which was dependent on the direction of some antenna somewhere. And we could barely connect with the community, and therefore nurses would walk up the mountain and then call us up if there was an emergency. So it was that bad. But in others also there is connectivity, but the internet connectivity is poor, and therefore any solution that does not take that into account adequately is a problem. And therefore I think a lot of effort from those developing technology to sit and be patient and work with the service providers is a gap that we have not been able to fully. At least we've tried a lot, and so far we have not fully got there, right? So there is a huge, I think, so pandemic is telling us that the other issue is that, as I said, that while they can enable, there are several things. For example, in a city, a teleconsultation, you consult and then you go out and buy drugs from somewhere, from a chemist, right? Or you can also probably ask the chemist to deliver it at your home through your internet or whatever, or a phone call. But in the rural areas, the areas that we work in, the nearest chemist shop is 25 kilometers away with one bus going there in a day. So there's no point in my doing a teleconsultation if I can't provide the drug to the person, or if I can't offer a diagnostic. And therefore, some of these, realities need to be considered. Not thinking that teleconsultation will solve all the problems, but how can teleconsultation empower and enable the existing systems, taking into consideration the infrastructure there is important.
Right. I think a lot of things that need to actually come together and use technology as as a facilitator. That's what I think we need to look at from this overall perspective. So my last question over here is that, what is your thought on this, Pavitra? When we all will emerge from this, we probably are imagining a society of people who might not be shaking hands, giving a hug, social distancing, wearing masks and gloves. All of this has already started to creep into the society. Economists are also predicting social venues like, say, cinema halls, theme parks, airports, your railway stations, malls. There is going to be a lot of decline in terms of footfall. Now, how are you expecting a new form of social behavior to take root? What is your thought process?
So frankly, Hiral, I have not thought about it because there's so much to think about right now that it is really difficult to envisage a word. And how will we, as I said, that we don't know enough about the virus and how it's going to pan out. How long, what will be the ways in which people, policies, the governments will behave, citizens will behave, what that relationship will be. But I would tend to believe that one is that there has been some change already, right? The cinema halls had started closing down, and Netflix, etc., are in any case becoming, so shops and malls were less frequented, but the e-commerce in any case is more. At the same time, I think the human need for love, for physical connection and contact will remain forever. How would we make that balance to for example, the last several weeks, while we have been active on the field, we've been running our clinic, we are traveling a lot to the field for relief as well as for overseeing the clinics. But our office contact with our colleagues has become much less. It's been largely replaced with phone calls or Zoom calls or whatever from our office colleagues here. And some of it I have personally found to be quite useful. I'm able to have a more relaxed conversation when I'm not physically kind of together than when I was when we would have all our meetings in person. So some of it has been okay. So I think we will find a new norm, but I think that is also because earlier we were very close. We were working very closely with each other. So now there is no need to be physically, at least for some point. I mean, till now. After some point, maybe we again will feel the need to come together. So I think this human need to be together, to have human connection, of love, of proximity, etc., would remain, and I think some form will emerge. And the fear also tends to decline with time, right? I mean, when it becomes a new norm. So I think one of the things we would accept it more. We would integrate it in our lives, right? I think it's a question of how do you fold a new problem in your life with the best of understanding that you have at your disposal.
Right. So yes, absolutely. New forms will emerge in terms of social distancing. In fact, indeed, insightful discussion, Sanjay, right? Thank you, Pavitra, as well for getting us all of these insights.
You're welcome. Thanks. I enjoyed speaking.
Absolutely. And it's such a privilege to have had you, Pavitra, on the show, because for us, this is a journey. The Enhanced Leadership series is a journey wherein we can discover along with you some new practices, new thoughts, new areas of impact. And it's truly remarkable what you and BHS have done. So thank you very much for being on our show.
Thanks so much. My pleasure.
Absolutely. In fact, thank you all for tuning in. Sanjay and I will be back tomorrow, same time, to share more extraordinary leaders in these extraordinary times. See you soon.
Thank you.